a matter of sentiment, of feeling, of the mood of the country, of what people's attitudes are to how things are in their country. Politics is a matter of sentiment. If over the next 18 months or 2 years, the mood of the country changes, if opinion polls consistently were showing 60, 65, 70% of people very anxious about leaving the EU, no longer wanting it, now thinking that it was a very bad mistake to do it, if that were the case, then our politicians, now look back to how our politicians have behaved in the last 11 months, you would think there's an absolute paradigm of pusillanimity and feebleness. In the Article 50 debate, for example, there they all went trooping into the lobby to trigger it, but complaining that they thought it was a bad idea. Well, this is a case where the pusillanimity and feebleness of our MPs are on our side. Because if there was consistent attitude in the country that people were against Brexit, it would frighten them enough to do something about Brexit not happening. There are 3 possibilities here. One is Mrs. May promised her own MPs in the Conservative Party that there would be a vote in Parliament on the terms of the deal. Now, she refused to put that commitment into the bill. She was asked to, but she refused. But she made the much more easily breakable promise by the vote that there would be a vote in Parliament on the bill. Well, if the mood of the country had changed very dramatically against Brexit, that vote might not go her way. So that is one little thought to bear in mind. Secondly, the case for another referendum, a referendum on the terms of a deal, is now absolutely unanswerable. People voted, the 37% of the electorate who voted to leave the EU did so on the basis of being told nothing about what the outcome of leaving would be. Once there is an outline of the deal and of the kind of arrangements that might be made, democracy requires that, quote unquote, the people be consulted again about the terms of the deal, because now at long last they will know something about what's in prospect. So there is an unanswerable case for a referendum on the deal. There's a complexity here, which is that, as you know, the legality of the situation is that within 2 years of triggering Article 50, that there has to be a sort of exiting of the country that wishes to leave from the EU. But of course, most of what will happen in the 18 months that now remain until then are agreements about transitional arrangements, and the transitional arrangements will have to take probably in excess of 5 years. I've given one of these talks in many places in England now, and in one of them, somebody who just retired from the EU Commission and had been in charge of negotiations with countries coming into the EU, like Croatia and so on, had said that most of those negotiations had taken closer to 10 years than to 5 because of the sheer complexities. Removing us from the EU is like taking the milk out of tea after you pour the milk in. Or, I sometimes use the analogy that we've been creating for nearly half a century now an economic and legal framework for all the nations of the European Union, which has made us like Siamese twins joined at the brain. So to try to separate us over hundreds of thousands of really complicated agreements and licensing arrangements and laws and almost impossible really to describe the complexities in less than a month or two of talking. And that has to be negotiated and dealt with, and so the transitional arrangements will take a very long time. This, by the way, is why the EU think that when there is a change of mood in the country, it would take nothing to get back in, because everything will still be in place. We will still effectively be subject to all those transitional arrangements, and so it will be very easy. So this business of working to change the mood of the country, to make sure that this mood that we share as Remainers stays strong, and that we get back the weakening Remainers, and that we change minds among leavers when we encounter them, in order to get this shift of sentiment, with the absolute reality, the absolute promise but we could either stay in or very quickly rejoin the EU as the prize of doing so. It takes effort, and it means that we have to look for opportunities to do this, and it means that we ourselves mustn't buy the effort being made by the Brexiters to let everything sink into the past and speak as if it's a done deal, using phrases like, the people have spoken, so it's going to happen, whatever. Don't accept that. That's a nonsense. You know, in politics, the sentiment that constitutes the real meat of politics is something which is manipulated by rhetoric, by how people speak and what they say. And you can go back through history, but you don't have to go back much further than Joseph Goebbels in the 1930s, who said, just keep saying something often enough, and just keep saying it as if it were true, and eventually people are going to start believing it. That country has spoken. Britain wants to leave the EU. The people have decided this is going to happen. Brexit is inevitable, and so on. It's all a lot of rubbish. It's not true, and things can be changed around by opposing it with our rhetoric. No, it's not a done deal. No, we don't accept it. We don't accept the legitimacy of it. We don't accept that the people have spoken. It's a minority of our country which want to leave, and we've got to persuade the rest of the country, and indeed those who now have regretted what they did, and get that mood to change so that it provides the right political circumstances either for a suitable vote in Parliament or another referendum. I'll end on this point, on the question of mood and sentiment. A friend of mine, after the referendum, in the months after the referendum, consoled himself a bit by collecting anecdotes, starting, my granny voted leave because, anecdotes of that form, because he found some of the anecdotes very amusing. And this is absolutely true, what I'm going to report to you. My granny voted leave because she thinks there's too much football on television. So that was one anecdote. My granny voted leave because she wanted the old light bulbs back. That was another one. My granny voted leave because the EU has piled too many regulations on us. Oh, which regulations bother you, Granny? Well, I don't know, but read the Daily Mail. Now, when I heard these anecdotes, I thought to myself, you know, there's something very interesting about this, which is that most of the people who voted leave, not the ones who have a very clear idea of what they would like the UK to be when it crashes out on a really hard Brexit. If they could get a really hard Brexit, we'd be out on our own, we would have to slash taxes, we'd have to get rid of all those regulations in order to get anybody to put any money into the country. It would be a much smaller pie because GDP would diminish. So much of the city would probably go to Europe, and they're big contributors to our GDP. It would be a smaller pie, but they would have a much bigger slice of it. So that's what they want. So we know about that. But for the rest, for all those different groups of people who were pulled together by this very clever technique, of big data technique of aggregating votes, what they had was an attitude or a feeling, an attitude that had been shaped and coached by the Mail and the Express and the Sun and the Eurosceptics over the years, made to feel that Europe was an inimical place, a hostile place which was ruining our lives in some way. And when people vote for a feeling, on the basis of a feeling, it's very difficult to persuade them differently. As Jonathan Swift said a long time ago, you cannot reason people out of views that they weren't reasoned into. So you have to find that emotional core that makes them feel as they do about Europe. One of the big mistakes of the Remain campaign was to talk only about the financial impact, the economic impact. In fact, as it turns out, they underestimated the damage. They were wrong, but they were wrong in the wrong way. They could have said things were going to be even worse than they described them. But had they talked about why Europe is such a great imaginative project, despite all its flaws and difficulties, as you would expect in any great project at that time. And look anywhere else. Is the United States of America heaven on earth? Does it not have its own problems? Well, mainly for Mr. Trump. They do have their own problems as well. But you say, this is something, idea of cooperation, of unity, of progress, of peace, of the peace that's been brought to Europe after such a long, scarred history. If you look indeed across the landscape of history, in all those periods where Europe was pretty well united, the Roman Empire, for example, and Christendom in the Middle Ages. It was more or less at peace with itself internally, except where there were family feuds, as in the 100 Years' War between England and France, which wasn't really a war between England and France, but among the members of relatives of a royal family who wanted bigger slices of their domain. So you can talk about the positives, and you can talk about the necessity for the future of being part of something which is very substantial, like the EU. The centre of gravity of the world is moving now to China. Since 1945, the majority of countries in the world have either become or have pretended to become democracies. Why? Because they've looked at the major democracies of the world, the US, Canada, Australia, the European countries. They've seen them as being the wealthiest, the most flourishing, and the most influential countries in the world with the most powerful militaries. So they thought to themselves, well, that's the way to go. But now, there's a new model on the block. And the new model on the block is a one-party state with a very, very